Thank you for inviting me. Happy New Year to everyone around the world. I hope 2021 is slightly better than 2020 or much better. I'm Gleb Bahmutov. I was at Cypress for almost 4 years. I was VP of engineering, kind of building it from like 5 people to 40 now, but now I'm just doing more coding, and so I changed my title. You can always find me on Twitter at Bahmutov. This presentation is beyond Hello World. I will see, maybe slightly more advanced topics, but I hope to explain how Cypress works under the hood so you understand it better. And even if you're a beginner, you'll find it more useful and more intuitive, and you'll understand how Cypress works behind the scenes. Before I begin, I have to say that, as always, a reminder that we are in a climate crisis. And if we don't act pretty soon, then literally our children are not going to survive here, right? Because agriculture will be destroyed, the seas will collapse, and so on. So we have to act. It's easy to change your lifestyle, but we have to act together, right? We have to act as groups. We have to influence our government. And you cannot do it by yourself unless you are super, super rich. So join an organization. There are a bunch of organizations all around the world that are working together. And for example, right now in Massachusetts, where I live, we almost are passing a very strong climate bill. Our governor doesn't want to sign it, but we'll force him eventually. Okay, so I had a question, right? If you go to Slido and if you use event code beyond hello, I just want to see maybe how experienced people are with Cypress, right? How long have you used Cypress? So I use it for 5 years, right? So, but I see majority are less than 1 year, but a few people never use it. That's fine, welcome. Yeah, so we have a spread, excellent, right? I wanna I say this to the users because I get this question a lot, especially through LinkedIn or through email. Hey, we just adopted Cypress at my organization. How do I get better, right? How do I learn it? Is there is there a secret? And if you ask me, if I were learning Cypress today, I would start with our documentation. If you go to our documentation and read Introduction to Cypress, I think it gives pretty good overview of what Cypress can do, how it does it, what to expect. After that, I would probably start watching tutorial videos. We have tutorial videos that we published that explain how to test, to do MVC, how to set up Cypress, and so on. And then we have a page with courses, and there are paid courses on Cypress and free courses on Cypress. So I would just go to that page, find links to the free courses, and start watching them. Most of them are like 1-2 hours, but they give you a perfect overview of what Cypress can do, how to do it. And these resources are free. So I think if you want to learn Cypress, this is an excellent resource. Of course, we do a bunch of Cypress webinars. So you can find webinars on topics, for example, how to set up code coverage, how to do visual testing. They're all available on our YouTube channel that Cypress has. And finally, we spend a lot of time, like many people notice, we have a lot of docs and they're pretty good and up to date. So don't ignore the documentation, right? I think the documentation is pretty complete and it allows you to kind of understand how to use a command, what it does behind the scenes. Okay, so I want, and the last thing, if you are at advanced topic, read the blog post. We have official Cypress blog where I blog a lot, and also like my blog posts that go for advanced. So I want to discuss the following now. So I was thinking about what to show or what to talk about in this presentation, because I want to go beyond Hello World. I don't want to just show like to do MVC and say, hey, and then we check a box and then we check number of items. So I was kind of adding all the things that I've never spoken about, right? That I never discussed, that are not in our documentation most of the time. And I have these topics that I will cover in my presentation. I'm interested if people are, and you can check as many topics as you want, if people are more interested in specific topic, or if I should spend more time on one of them versus the others, right? So it seems like Cypress tips and tricks are pretty popular. Great. Cypress in databases. Right. Negative assertions. I'm pretty positive about negative assertions. That's great. Wait. I don't believe you. Nobody's interested how to open a good Cypress GitHub issue. Okay, finally, someone. Okay. So I'm gonna start with read file, side task, and like the difference between Node and the browser when you use Cypress. So I want to remind everyone that Cypress tests run in the browser, right? Like this is the #1 fact or architectural decision that you have to remember. Like the test runs in the browser. So you cannot just require, file system module from Node and say read file. Like it's not gonna work because that doesn't work in a regular browser. So it definitely will not work in Cypress spec. So here's how Cypress works. On the left, you see the Cypress Electron application, right? That's what you execute when you do like Cypress open, Cypress run. It runs in Node, right? It's a Node application. And then it launches the browser. And the browser could be Electron, could be Firefox, could be Chrome, right? Could be new Microsoft Edge. Inside the browser, when it loads, you have two iframes. In an app iframe, that's where your application will run. And then there's a second iframe where your support files and your spec files run, right? And because we use two different iframes, they don't, pollute each other, right? Like your application thinks it's just running by itself. Well, in Cypress itself, in Node process, that's where your plugin file runs. And if you want to access the Node system, the easiest and most powerful thing is for your spec file to use side task and send a command to the plugin file saying, execute this task in Node. So that's Cypress architecture. So, what can you do if you want to really access Node? And you might, want to access Node for many things. For example, you might want to read file or write file. So the interesting things about these 4 commands that we have for accessing the Node is read file retries, write file doesn't retry because you just want to write file once. Task is the most powerful, and I'll show examples of using task. And sci-exec is kind of like escape. I don't use it personally because it's too operating system specific. So unless you're going to another language and have to execute some other shell script, I would not recommend using it. So here's an example with retries. So read file is really popular. Let's say you have some JSON with settings, fixtures, whatever. And you want to confirm that it works. So in my to-do MVC, after I enter 4 items, I want to read the JSON file. And when we read JSON file, we automatically parse it into an object. And then if we add an assertion, if we say, you get data should have 4 items, and the first item, should be the one we expected, we entered first. This combination of a command and retries will repeat the command until the assertion passes. So you might not notice this when your application is fast, if it saves each item right away. But if you have some kind of network delays or application is slightly slower, then you will see it very well. See, my command and assertion just spins, waits, retries until the file is there and it has the right items. Now let's look at my favorite, right? People ask this all the time, and I think I'll have this poll later. When I'm testing my web application and there's a backend database, right? How do I can query the database? How can I reset the state, for example, as well? And for that, you have to use side task, right? Imagine if you don't use it, right? You might say, give me all persons and it should be empty. If you start with a task, it passes every time because your database is empty, everything is fine. But then you add the second test, and that second test posts a new item. And when it checks that, there is one item returned by your API. Now, this works, right? Those two tests, they work by themselves at first. But after you run them, even once, they start failing because the database still has that additional item. And so the first test fails and the second one fails after it runs once. So we want to control the state of our database because we want to start with empty slate and we don't want each test to affect each other. So what can we do? Well, we need to connect to the database. That means we need not to run in a browser, we have to run a node. So we might write in our plugin file a task. We say on task command, we'll have a task named reset people table. And here we want to clear the table. Well, my tip to you is reuse exactly the same code that your application that's running, right, your server is doing to connect to the database. So here's how it looks. Before I continue, I want to ask if you ever tried or if you ever hit this problem, right? If you had a database and you wanted to test it, you want to reset its state, maybe set some number of items, or before the test, reset it, truncate the table so that you start with fresh. Okay, so about half people here, maybe 40%, had this problem. Great. So here's my code that I write in my plugin file that connects to the database and then uses the code from my application source, for example, to access the person table. If you look at this code and you kind of compare it to the application code, right? In my server file, it's exactly the same code, literally. I just copied the way I do connection and config and create my models, right? So our plugin file will now have access. We'll try to connect to the database exactly using the same approach as our application. Now, as soon as you run this, you will hit this error. And this is very common. So in this case, it says, hey, I was trying to connect to the database. In this case, it's SQLite free, but it could be Oracle, MS Server, Postgres, you name it. And I could not find the module, and the module gives the full name and says binding electron, node. So in order for us to connect to a database, we can just run JavaScript code because most of the drivers for connecting to a database, they're compiled, they're binary for performance reasons. So when this Cypress plugin file runs, also it cannot connect. It doesn't find the right binding file. The thing is, the binding files are specific to node version. So for example, if we print the node version that we're using is 12.14.1 right now, we can see that when we ran npm install, we install a binding for that node version. When we do Cypress version command, it will print the Cypress version and also Electron and the node that's bundled inside the Cypress itself. And you can see that the node version is 12.18.3, right? And so it's mismatch between what we install binding for 12.14.1, but when we ran Cypress, it uses the bundle node version 12.18.3. So the solution is go to the Cypress JSON file and say node version instead of bundled, just say system. And in that case, when plugin file runs, it will actually use the node version found on the system and not the bundle in, okay? And then all the native extensions will work and you'll be able to connect to the database. So once the connection is established, we can write our task. And in this case, when you reset people table, I can use the model class to access the table and say truncate, meaning any previous records, just delete them all, start fresh. And you will see the output of this command, right? That says resetting people table, not in the browser, but in your terminal, because this code runs in Node in the same terminal where you start Cypress. And then you can run your test as many times as needed, because before every test, it will go truncate the table and start fresh. Okay, here's a very common issue. Our web application has API, and the API defines routes. And the routes are, in this case, are REST. You can post a new person, you can get all persons, you can patch a person, you can delete it. But notice that we are missing something. There is no REST endpoint that we want to expose in production that says, get me just one person by ID. Right? Our application doesn't allow that. So what do we do in our test if you want to confirm that that particular person or that particular ID exists? We can fetch everything and then, but like it's probably unnecessary. So here's what we can do. If we have a test like this that posts an item, right, and then gets back an ID of a new item, and then patches and, for example, replaces the last name of a person, right? Well, that test passes. But now we want to assert that that person is there and updated. Okay, so you might think, well, I'll just add more methods to my REST API, but maybe you can't. Maybe you don't expose those methods, even under testing. So in this case, just write a task, right? Be able to query a person by ID, not through the REST API, but through a task. And you'll be able to use it during the testing, but never accidentally expose it through your REST API. So in this case, we have a person model that allows us to interact with a database table. And when we run the task find person, we'll use person query find by ID, and whatever ID we passed, we'll find that object and return it and yield it from the task. So in our spec file that runs in the browser, we'll just say task find person ID. And then if you click on the task in the browser, in the DevTools console, it will print the object that it found in a database and send to the browser and yield it from the task execution. So we see that we actually have the same first name, Joe, ID 1, last name, the one we updated, so it works correctly, and then a couple of fields that have default values of null. We can confirm that the object that we found has those fields. Now you can use deep equal in your assertion, right? But it's very strict, right? It says like all the fields should be there with those values and nothing else. Well, in this case, we don't care about default fields. We just want to say, hey, the ID should be what we expect it to be, and the first name and last name, and that's it. So I like using include, but works very well for checking just part of object. And then in my command log, I can see every property, existing and so on. If one of the properties doesn't exist, then I'll see passing assertion for other properties and then failing assertion for like another property that doesn't exist or has a different value. The one thing that people ask a lot is, if my task requires multiple arguments, right? What do I do? For example, if my task that adds two numbers expects like A and B, I can't just say task add numbers 2 and 3, right? Task only allows a single object with arguments and then like log options. So you have to combine separate arguments, as many as there are, into a single object and pass that object to the task. So in this case, we'll just say, hey, we'll pass an object, A, B, and the values I want to add. And inside the task, you can take that single options object, destructure it, grab A and B, and return the result. And because the tasks run in Node, right, even the bundled version of Cypress is very modern Node, right, 12.18.3, right? So it understands async await. In your spec files, you should never use async await because of promise chains and retries. Like promises don't support that at all. So you will just shoot yourself in the foot if you try to use it. But inside the plugins file, there are no retries, right? It's all asynchronous promise returning commands. So you can write those things in a plugin using async await if that's what you're comfortable with. So in our case, if you want to query and then query database one more, just use async await. Now, the one thing that the task requires, in order for us to know when you're really done and not accidentally like returned, you cannot return undefined. You have to return a value or a promise that's resolved with value. And value could be null, but it cannot be undefined, right? If it's undefined, it will fail the command. So in our case, when we're querying the database in this case, if it doesn't find a person by ID, it will return undefined. So in this case, at line 6, I'm just saying, hey, if you find nothing, just return null, because that will properly finish the task. One thing that I love doing is to make sure that my plugin and my tasks verify their arguments. So for example, when we find person by ID, what happens if we pass undefined ID, right? If we forget to pass it? What happens if we pass invalid ID, right? So what we can do, you can say, if type of ID is not number, just throw an error. Like throw an error yourself. Okay, that's great. We can actually go one step beyond that, and we can say, hey, Cypress uses chai assertions. Well, that's in bundle, that's in the browser. When you run inside the plugins, they're not exposed, they're not NPM module. It's all bundled in and built inside Cypress application. So if you want to use chai assertions, you have to install them yourself. So I'll install chai. And in my plugin file, I'll require chai. I will get the expect command. And then when I'm inside the find person task, the first thing I'll do, I'll just write a normal test assertion. I'll just say it should be a number and should be above 0, right? Because the first object in table gets ID of 1. So I'll verify and I'll use it. And here's how it looks when I'm just changing my test, right? And Cypress reruns. If I forget to pass, I'll get an error because assertion will fail, throw an error, the side task will pick it up and show it in the browser. So I will see if I forgot it, if it's invalid, right? So again, if I forget to pass it, I'll say expected undefined to be a number. That's the error message from, right? If it's 0, expected 0 to be above 0. If it's 5, then it says did not return an object. So I'm returning undefined. So the one thing that you have to remember is that if that assertion fails, if it doesn't find something, or if ID is incorrect, side task will not rerun itself, right? Because side task probably changes something. It's not idempotent. It's not like you can safely retry it again and again. So if you want to retry accessing the database and waiting for the record to exist, you'll have to write with logic yourself. So I have a blog post that kind of explains how to do it. It's not that difficult. There are utilities that retry promises, but you'll have to add that code. It's not built in as in your spec file. Okay, another tip. Here's how I usually work with my application and Cypress. Very common question is, I need to start the application. Once it starts, run my tests. So in my package.json, usually I have the following scripts. I have normal, kind of start, migrate, all the, kind of scripts that start my application, right? These are my app commands. If I deploy my app to production, I probably will use them to start it. And then I usually have Cypress commands, so I don't have to write yarn Cypress open or npx Cypress run. So I have script aliases to open Cypress run. And then usually I have to work with things locally. So I like writing a script dev that uses start test that comes from start serve and test. And by default, it uses start command to start my application, waits for specific port or URL to respond, and after it responds, then it opens Cypress. So if I want to do test log, local test-driven development, right? I can just do npm run dev, and my application is ready, Cypress is ready, and I can just update the test. And then I also usually have a local script that does the same, but just does Cypress run, kind of like what CI would do, right? The CI will start the application, wait for it to respond, and then run all the specs using Cypress run. So sometimes to verify this, I'll just do npm run local to run all the specs. Okay, back to the database, almost like back to the future. One of the questions in a more realistic application, it's not going to be a single table. Let's say you're trying to set up a whole application where you might have actors, movies, their relationships. So if you're testing Matt Damon, for example, you don't want to start from scratch. You want to have that database pre-filled with data so you're ready to go. You don't want to recreate it call by call. So how do you set up complex database with a bunch of tables, relationships for specific spec to start in a good location? Well, you could set up a task and then call it before the test from the spec, just to go back to the node land and so on. So in Cypress 6.2, we added an experimental feature. So you have to set a flag to actually enable it. And this introduces hooks, but not in a spec file, but hooks that run in your plugin file. And they're before run, before spec, after run, right? So kind of, from the name, you can see. So let's look at before spec. So in my plugin file, I can say on before spec, before we even open the browser, before that spec loads, we can say, well, if its name is Matt Damon spec, just load a fixture and set the entire database to that fixture, right? Like we have methods for that in our production code. And it's nice. Spec comes out and it's ready to go. It has complex database setup. And I never had to manually worry about that for that spec file because everything is already in Node. The problem with that is that right now those hooks are only executed when you use Cypress run mode. So here's how your spec can determine if it's using Cypress open or Cypress run. You can say Cypress config is interactive, which is a special value that we put. It's not in your Cypress JSON. It's set automatically depending on the mode. So it will return true if you're using Cypress open mode. So in that case, you'll say, hey, I'm in Cypress open mode. I want to set my database so you can execute before spec task that you can define, right? And you can just pass the spec name. And so you define your own task that runs in Cypress open, but you redirect to the same on before spec initialization code. So it runs automatically in Cypress run, or you call it using site task in Cypress open. And now you have the same code to initialize your database to set all the tables, all the relationships in both modes. All right. The interesting thing here is that I suggest that you don't recreate all that code that deals with databases, right, yourself. I think the much better thing would be to reuse as much of your production code from Cypress as possible. So think about your REST API. Somewhere, there are a bunch of utilities that actually do things. Just put them in like utils or whatever source file you want. When you have your API, you probably connect it through a table that says on every post to /persons URL, you want to insert whatever the client has sent you, extracted from request body. So when things arrive for REST API, you want to say, okay, now actually put it into the database and return the result. Great. And in your testing code, you can, in a plugin file, import exactly the same insert persons. And so from inside the task, you just use the production code and pass wherever you pass as an argument. So you don't read it from a request object body. You just pass it directly because Cypress takes care of those details. So you redirect to the same common code and you use it from production code and from the plugin code. So you don't have to write it again and again. And all it goes through the same kind of logic. Okay, so I kind of discussed the serious thing, right? That's what you would use before spec, set complex data. But you can do so much. For example, there is a built-in hook for plugin file that's called after spec. And this is something you cannot recreate using after hook in your spec file, because if you run it, well, the spec hasn't finished yet. So you don't have a video, for example. But in this case, in a plugin, this event runs after the whole spec finishes, the video is ready, but before video, for example, is uploaded to the dashboard. So here you can say, well, if there is no video, I'll do nothing, right? And if there is video, well, you can do your thing with a video, right? So you have a video file name, and maybe you want to delete it if test passed. Okay, that's good. So we will not upload the video for passing test. Or you can write your own code that will change the video and like recode it to make it look old. So I have this little utility that I've written to vintage video in my source files, and you can find the code in this pull request. And we'll publish a blog post on Cypress blog soon. But basically, it takes every video of every spec file and makes it look like this. Right? It applies a mask, it changes colors, but it makes it look like a very old movie reel. And the cool thing, because this happens before you upload things to the dashboard, right? Even on the dashboard, you will see those old-time videos. And I think they're pretty cool. Okay, so I talked about the browser versus Node, and I covered the Node tips and tricks and side tasks. And now I want to switch more to the browser API. So I'll discuss a couple of things that come up again and again, and then I'll finish with GitHub issues and documentation, and I'll show something that's really, really cool. So stay tuned. So Cypress plugin file executes in Node land, Cypress spec executes in the browser. They can communicate for like read file, write file, task, and so on. So let's talk about the browser side. The number one advantage that Cypress has over every other testing tool is that the specs execute in the browser, right? In the same browser window as your application code. That means you have direct access to all the window objects. For example, there's a window navigator object that in Chrome has battery, right? That tells you if your laptop is plugged, if it's charging, what's the battery life, and so on. You can directly in Cypress code access that object, set values, and then your application will think that it's at 50% battery. So if you're testing your application that needs access to it, it's so easy to directly access that object, modify it, confirm how it works. Which is really interesting when you think about things like what people say are the hardest thing in Cypress, or its biggest limitation: you cannot open a second tab. So how do you open a second tab? You have a anchor link with a target blank, right? And when you click on that link, right now in Cypress, when it clicks, it actually opens second browser, and Cypress doesn't see it, so the test gets nowhere. So what can you do about this? Well, you can grab the anchor link and then just verify its attributes. You can say the attribute href should be, about page, and the target should be blank. You're not clicking it, but you're verifying that the properties of a link are correct. And you can expect the browser to do the right thing when a user clicks on the link, because if a browser is broken, well, there's not much you can do. You can take it one step further and say, okay, I really want to click on it. So you know what you can do? After you verify everything, like all the attributes, you can go and change the attribute target on that particular anchor link and then click it, right? So what happens in this case? And then you can confirm, the location is about. Well, as this video shows, you changing the attribute after verifying it changing it so it opens in the current window, and then it all works, right? You're loading the about exactly the same way as you would open it in another tab, but you're opening inside the same tab, and you can continue your testing there, right? What if it's not an anchor link? What if the application code actually has an event click and then says window open and then says about HTML? If it, like, as it's written right now, if you do nothing, if you click on it again, it opens by default in a second tab or second window. Now, remember, you have direct access to the window object. It's a plain JavaScript object that you can control. So what you can do, I apologize, the window kind of appears. The video appears too quickly. You can visit the page and then grab the window and stub it using built-in Synon stub. Window has a method open, and you just stub it and say as open. And then you can click on it, and then you can check that your stub was really called once with the arguments that you want to verify. So in this case, it runs, right? It doesn't actually go anywhere because you stubbed it. You stubbed that execution, right? You just verified that it actually went there correctly. And you assume the browser works correctly, right? If it's broken, then like, what are we talking about? But you can take it a little bit further and say, I want to verify that the whole thing works. So in this case, instead of just stubbing it, you can do the following. You can invoke fake function. So you say, replace window open with this little function. Verify that the target, right, after URL was undefined, but you're not passing something else. And then you can call the original wrap method, the original window open, but instead of passing undefined target, you'll pass self. So you're saying open, call window open with the same URL that user wanted, but only inside the self window. And then you actually click it and then verify that it called, and then you can verify the URL as well. So direct access to all the objects inside the browser is a great thing, because then you can bypass all the limitations, at least in my mind. Okay, what else? Well, let's say service workers, right? The service workers usually give problems because they can affect everything. How does your app even behave if a service worker is not there? If a browser doesn't support it, if it's disabled, you can, before the application loads and loads the service worker, you can just delete the service worker from the navigator object. And when your application will load, check, hey, do I have service worker? Oh, no, okay, well, I guess I'll have to work without it. The interesting thing, you don't have to put it inside the visit itself, right? You can just register a on window before load event, right? But will be called in that particular test. And that's where you can delete window, navigate a service worker. And if you want to do it for all windows, right? So you don't have to remember doing it again and again. You can use capital Cypress on window before load, but will apply to all the tests. And if you want to apply to all the tests, not just in that spec file, just move it into support file and do it there. And inside your spec, just do visit. Because remember, when Cypress runs in the browser, the support file literally just loads first, and the spec loads second. So it's literally like concatenating all the files like that together. So it works the same way. Okay, Cecilia's favorite topic, negative assertion, right? Imagine I have positive assertions, right? If I get number of items, right, should be 2, positive assertion. I have class completed. So these are called positive, but something should not have a class, should not be visible, negative. And I notice people do mistakes in negative assertion because they're a little bit counterintuitive. For example, let's say we have a loading indicator when we visit, right? When we visit, app wants to load something, and we say the loading indicator should go away. Well, it runs and it passes. But notice there is something weird about this. That assertion passes before the AJAX call, all right? That's suspicious. In my particular application, I can delay it. I can delay the loading of the data. So the same test, right? Now you see that it passes even before the AJAX call, right? The thing is, the negative assertion before the event that actually changes the state and then it goes to negative usually passes like immediately before the application does its thing. So what you really want to do is, as a rule of thumb, is always first do a positive assertion, like the loading element should first be visible and then it should go away. Okay. So in this case, first it waits for loading indicator to be visible and then invisible. In this case, you don't see the indicator because it appears so quickly. So this test is flaky, right? Because sometimes the indicator can be so quick that Cypress doesn't catch it. You can use test retries to solve it. But even better thing is to use intercept and say, when there is a request to the server, delayed by, let's say, 2 seconds or whatever, and make sure the loading indicator is visible and then it's invisible, okay? And now it's very clear, okay, the request goes out, we have loading indicator, and now we're waiting for it to go away, okay? So remember, put positive assertion and then negative, so the negative assertion doesn't pass for a wrong reason. Okay, one thing that I noticed a lot is, as a rule of thumb, you should never install Cypress globally, right? Every project can use its own version, right? You don't know which version this project supports. We have a lot of them. So if you install locally, then the cached Cypress version, they accumulate very quickly. We do releases every 2 weeks, and every version of Cypress probably takes ½ GB of space. You can complain about that, or you can just trim unused Cypress versions. So we have a command Cypress cache list. You can add size to see the size of each version, right? And then you can use Cypress cache prune in a project, and it will automatically remove all our versions from your cached folder, okay? So you don't have to suffer and remove them manually using disk utilities. The other tip that I really strongly suggest is that you set up IntelliSense for your spec files, and you also look up how to set up IntelliSense for your Cypress JSON files. Okay, notice you can, in most code editors, you can just specify the schema and give this URL. And then when you hover over base URL or all other properties, your code editor will tell you like what are allowed values for that particular Cypress JSON property. Okay, power tip. Every command is documented. You can just say on Cypress IO/type and you'll go immediately to that command. Most of the concepts, right, but we have, like you want to look up how to use CI or Docker, just use that word and you'll go immediately there. Even better, we have a pretty good documentation search, right? So if you use our search, you'll find our API docs, our blog posts, and our recipes, right? All those things, right, will be found. So in addition to that, you can even search our documentation using npx scsearch. It goes to exactly the same backend. So when you type, it uses the same search. So you can search our documentation in multiple ways. Okay, for advanced topics, these are my blog posts on my personal blog, but are tagged with Cypress. As you can see, I've been trying to describe how to use Cypress for something specific for a long time, since 2016. My favorite blog post is Cypress tips and tricks, right? There are sections that describe, like what I've just, for example, shown here, that I knew how to deal with target blank and how to deal with window open. So usually you can find an answer there. Okay, something else I want to mention. People complain Cypress is broken, doesn't do that, doesn't support A11. How come we all haven't jumped on A11, which is something Cecilia should have done a long time ago? So here's a snapshot of my life. So if you go to Cypress Insights and you look at monthly. So monthly, we had almost 300 issues, right? Open and closed. So it's a lot. Even today, in 24 hours, we already had almost 20 issues open, majority open. I closed a few because we resolved them. So there is a lot of activity that you can see from inside, but it's not all. Here's my mailbox for Cypress notifications for the last 24 hours, right? This is me scrolling through like all notifications for open issues and new GitHub issues for just Cypress repository. And we have other repositories, right? So now I'm getting to yesterday and the day before. As you can see, we're actually looking at most of them. At least, like I open most of them, right? Like other people open others. And this is just GitHub for one repository. We also have, support and other notification emails, right? We're doing our best to kind of keep with, with a flood, but it's a lot of stuff that's happening. So if you have a problem, don't just go open an issue and then, we'll feel bad if we cannot resolve it really quickly. Just search our docs, like I showed, search our open issues. Now, GitHub is really bad at search, right? If you enter like issue text, like it's hard. So here's my tip. Look at the topics. So if your error is, let's say with site-intercept, the new intercept, or with multiple domains, or browser, or parallelization, go through the issues and click on labels, and then enter topic and search for that. And you will see we have, like right now, 63 labels by different topics. And if you have a problem with, like, say, visibility, right, on network or local storage, see if we have a topic, because then you can just click on those, on the topic, and find all existing open and closed issues and see if there is something that matches your case. And in that case, you can find the details. But if nothing else matches, here's my tip. Open a new GitHub issue, it's fine. We love, right? If you can provide us a reproducible code so that we can run it, like npm install, npm sci open, and then we see the problem, the chances are high that we'll fix it. It's not guaranteed, but the chances are pretty low if we don't have code to reproduce it, unfortunately. So you can use some of our starter repositories, like the basic Cypress test, tiny, or if it's something advanced, you can take Cypress example recipes and like 70 recipes, or you can prepare a repository. Whatever you do, fill the issue template. When you open an issue, it will, in GitHub, it will say, is this a bug? Yes. Here are all the things you want to know, like Cypress version, the code you ran, the screenshots, so on. I want to stress it. If you just open an issue, it doesn't work, here's a snippet of my custom code. We cannot help you. I'm sorry, it just cannot happen, okay? The other thing is that you don't have to provide like all the little things. If your issue is just a spec file and doesn't have plugins or support, just set them to false. Don't even include them, right? Like limit your issue and your production to more specific thing that we can run to see your problem. Okay, you've been very good. I'll go to the questions in 2 slides, right? But I wanna show you something cool. Okay, so many people ask, can I record a test by clicking around, right? So here it is. It's called Cypress Studio. As you can see, you just interact with the page and look at the left where see commands automatically pre-filled, right? And then you click save and it updates your spec file. And this is coming out as experimental feature on Tuesday, Cypress 6.3.0. So I'm looking forward, right? Because it will allow you to quickly create a test and maybe add a couple of assertions in your source files, but it should be pretty cool feature, right? We definitely ask everyone to try it, give us feedback, see if it's useful, right? See if you can write realistic tests using Cypress Studio. Okay. The interesting thing about this particular work, you can track it, right? There's a pull request 9542. It actually closes an issue that was open a long time ago, right? Like if you see like such a low issue number, that means it was difficult, right? So that's why we're only now solving it, but it was important to our users So that's why we're doing it now. So I'm really happy that we are progressing on this issue. Okay, my slides are available. You can reach me everywhere. You can find all my projects. Thank you very much. And let's go to questions. Okay. So I will mark the question I'm about to answer. All right. Okay. We have a scenario to execute payment gateway. So we need multiple domains and travel from one to another. Okay. So this multi-domain thing where you want to go on one domain, right, and then continue to the second, come back. We work on it. We're calling it session API, where you can do part of your test on one domain, save it, go to another domain, do something else, and then go back, restore your session, right, and then continue. It's almost like doing something in one browser, then continuing in our browser, and then coming back to that browser and continuing there. So the work is ongoing. It's under review right now from Brian. So I think it will be done maybe in the next month or two. Okay, besides page object model, is there any object design pattern we should follow in order to develop test scripts more efficiently? So I look at our Cypress real world app, right? But you can find link from our documentation. I think it shows pretty good patterns. You know, we organize spec files by feature, right? We put them in folder and subfolders, and inside the test, we abstract common things through custom commands and little reusable functions, right? So you don't, like, I'm personally against page objects. I think they add unnecessary level of abstraction. But one thing that I suggest, no matter what you pick, page objects, you know, cucumber, syntax, anything, is that you really want to make sure that you keep your test code up to the same standard as your production code, which means open pull requests, right? If you refactor tests, or if you add a new feature, have tests to come with it. So you can discuss things and review it as a team and not say, well, our test code is written by someone else and nobody looks at it, nobody knows how it works, so whatever they organize, it's fine. You really want to review the test code and say, hey, it's duplicate, oh, we'll have constants for this, or it seems like this command already exists, or why don't you set the database before you start? So make sure you pull request review your Cypress code as well, and then, you know, pick whatever code format or organization or principle that you want. Okay, are there any good examples to follow the structure of Cypress test framework for different teams to work more efficiently? So for one thing, again, look at our real world app example, right? I think that's structured pretty well. Look at our Cypress documentation. It's an open source repository. We tested using Cypress on every commit. You can see how we organize the code there as well. But one other thing I would suggest, if you go to our webinars channel, you will see our webinars with other companies. And I'm not saying like this, like the only ways to organize. And those are definitely are not what I would say pure marketing, right? Every company that has done a webinar with us actually like approached us and say, we love Cypress, this is how we use it. Do you have any suggestions? And we say, we might give suggestions, or we say, great, but like, do you want to showcase what you've done? All right. So the webinars are real companies running hundreds of specs, showing you through our webinars how they structure their commands, how they structure the spec files, how they run them on CI. So look through our webinars. I think it's a good learning, you know, demonstration of how to work efficiently with Cypress. What if you don't have a production code to connect to a database, right? So if your database runs somewhere else in the cloud, you cannot do anything, right? So in this case, you have to invent something. For example, you might have REST APIs. Like, I didn't have them, so I decided to connect to a database directly from my spec file, and I could, and so on. But let's say you don't have it. Well, somehow you have to build up state through your test or before your test through some other means. For example, in your staging environment, you might expose additional REST endpoint, and you might hardcode some kind of secret so that Cypress can access it and say, truncate the table, but nobody else can, right? Because you don't want regular users to do that. So it's up to you. Now it became like, how do you test things? What do you know about things? The ultimate thing, if you cannot do that, is to mark the backend completely, right? Like mark all the network or most of the network, right? Using sci-intercept, because sci-intercept can do pretty much anything. So your application might think it talks to a real backend, but in reality, it's all network stubs. So, but I think it's the last resort, because you really won't be exercising your backend as well in your end-to-end test. Okay, do you plan to extend Cypress perfect capacity, thank you for that, to mobile platforms? Well, that's a difficult question. We definitely don't have any plans for testing native mobile application. It's completely different architecture. We probably can't. And it will take our focus away. So here are our plans right now. Right now we're working with Safari team, right? Actual like Apple developers, to see if we can test desktop Safari, right? There are some limitations that they can remove, but it will be a while before we release it or even work on it. So right now we're thinking how we can work meanwhile on just general like WebKit browser, not Safari that's based on it, but on general WebKit browser and test it, all right? And then Safari will come along, but it's going to be desktop. If we can do a desktop Safari, we'll see what we can do about mobile Safari, right? Because that's the real challenge. But it will require some reorganization of our code so that we can separate the command log and the browser running at your machine from browser we load on a device and so on. So we're work in progress. There is no current work on A11, so what can I say? What's a great JavaScript course you can recommend so we can understand Cypress much better? So this is an excellent question, all right? Cypress is JavaScript because JavaScript is the only thing that runs on the browser. We're definitely hearing this question, right? I will see if I can come up with links and advice that we can put on our frequently asked questions on our documentation and answer it, right? So whoever asks this question, what's a great JavaScript course, just ping me on Twitter or by email to make sure that I do that. Because this question comes up again and again, and I should have done like written an answer and have a link available. But it, definitely something we'll put in our docs. Okay, I showed BeforeSpec hook, right, that runs in your plugin. Why is it limited to run? Originally, we kind of thought, well, if you're running inside interactive mode with Cypress open, when you reload the spec again and again, like you don't want to run that because that might recreate things. Right now, when we looked at what we're actually using it, we're collecting actual real world usage examples. And now I'm thinking, yeah, we should run it all the time because, for example, my code coverage plugin would be so much simpler if I could just rely on this, right, in Cypress open and Cypress run and reset the code coverage. So we're thinking of switching it. Brian Mann thinks, yeah, we definitely kind of made a mistake. But one thing, this kind of feature is experimental. You have to enable experimental flag for it to work. While a feature is experimental, that's what we are experimenting and releasing it for, so we can come up with usage examples and see if we have to change it before we make it available and part of the core. So right now we're like, yeah, we messed up. We probably will add it next to all modes. It's not difficult to run in all modes. Do you have any advice when working with big databases and cleaning up? It's up to you. I have no idea. The one thing that we kind of saw is that if you have big database, make sure that you can clean up and truncate only what you need to. All right. If you have large 10 tables, but your test really needs data in one, don't truncate the whole database. Just clean up exactly what you need, but not more. Would you suggest leaving the Cypress specs in Cypress integration folder or in the app directory right next to the code? So I would keep them separate, right? Just because you probably have different linting rules, right? For example, we have ESLint Cypress plugin, but can catch common like Cypress mistakes, like using async await or leaving like it.only, things like that, right? So you probably want to have specs separate from your app code because it's not directly tied one-to-one, right, to your code. It's basically end-to-end test. It's not really corresponding to one file. The only caveat, right now we are bringing component testing into the core. So we have a team of people who took over my project of like Cypress React unit test, Cypress Vue unit test. In that case, it makes sense to keep the component spec right next to your source file. So you will see that Cypress integration specs live separately, but component spec files live right next to the code. So that's where I see an advantage there. Okay, so I've heard about Cypress unit test, and can you talk about when this is a good approach versus using a specific unit test libraries like I assume Jest, Ava, Mocha? Okay, so Cypress runs in the browser, and I keep repeating it, right? But the specs execute in the browser, which means they can run your end-to-end browser test. Also, from your browser, they can load all your source code that's supposed to run in the browser. If you have a function that says like, add A and B together, that's a universal JavaScript. You can load it from browser or from Node. If you can load in browser, you can load it from Cypress, and it will be a unit test. Okay. Now, Cypress is slower than your unit test, right, library, because it actually opens a browser and has to initialize itself and so on. So just as much faster if you're testing A plus B. Okay. Now, we have a team that's for last year has been working on Node unit testing, on Node end-to-end testing, right? Think end-to-end, think like, I want to start my web server and run like end-to-end test on it and make sure it responds to REST API request with like what's expected. Now, that will come out maybe in this quarter, right? That will replace Jest, Mocha, Ava. It's faster than those testing tools. It's better. It has our UI, right? So you can time travel debug, see everything, and so on. So in that case, you will use traditional Cypress for your browser test, and that's like Cypress Node test runner for any code that runs in Node. Okay, last question. Where will be integration with BrowserStack in the future? So this is an interesting question. So BrowserStack already allows you to run Cypress on the architecture, right? They have like Docker image or container with Cypress pre-installed. They grab the test results, they show it on their dashboard, right? So they've done it by themselves. We cannot limit them. So they do it. But I think the question is slightly different. Can, for example, your Cypress that runs on your CI connect to the browser that's controlled by BrowserStack, right? So for example, they spin like Firefox specific version and you just connect from Cypress, control it, run your test. Right now, no, we've been thinking about it. It's very difficult, right? To control remote browser and recreate everything. So potentially, yes, but it's way behind our features that I think we will have more impact. Okay, and the last question, is there a chance with the single origin limitation one that, so this is our session API, right? With session APIs, you'll be able to save the state of browser, go to another origin, do something there, go back to the first origin and continue the test there. So hopefully it will disappear. I cannot give any dates just yet because once we release it, it will be experimental. We'll figure out if it actually works correctly for use cases, and then we'll release it like officially. So stay tuned, but I think it will be possible one day. Excellent, excellent. I answered hopefully all your questions. And thank you so much again for everyone listening to me. I hope I did not bore you to death with